He gave his jacket to a freezing stranger, but had no idea she was a powerful CEO. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The wind sliced through the streets of downtown Chicago with an unforgiving sharpness, the kind that seeped into your bones and refused to let go. Snow fell steadily from a sky that looked as heavy and worn as the man standing alone at the bus stop beneath a flickering street lamp. Ethan Walker, 42, clutched a manila folder close to his chest as if it contained more than just 5 rejected resumes. It held everything: his hope, his dignity, the last threads of his former life. The folder was damp from the snow, just like his fraying boots, just like the collar of the olive green jacket that barely shielded him from the cold. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to stay warm, but every movement reminded him of how thin his socks had become, how the soles of his shoes let the cold in like open windows. The city, usually loud and unrelenting, had gone silent under the snowfall, as if mourning something no one had the words to name. Ethan didn't have anywhere to be anymore. Not really. He'd been laid off 2 years ago when the bridge project he'd helped lead was abandoned halfway through due to budget cuts. A crumbling economy had taken his job, but life had taken more. Cancer had taken his wife. The courts had taken his son. And time had taken everything else. A red digital pharmacy sign blinked across the street. 9:06 p.m. No bus, no people, no escape from the wind. Then, from across the street, she appeared. She was out of place. A woman in her early 30s, dressed in a pencil skirt, a silk blouse, and no coat. Her hair clung to her cheeks in damp strands, her heels clicking faintly against the icy sidewalk. She looked like someone who had come straight from a meeting in a glass tower and gotten lost somewhere between privilege and reality. When she reached the bus stop, she didn't speak. She just stood beside Ethan, her arms wrapped tightly around her body, shivering so hard her shoulders shook. Ethan glanced at her, then away. He didn't want to stare. People had stared at him enough, but he couldn't ignore her either. She was trembling, clearly unprepared for the brutal cold of a Midwestern winter night. And yet, she looked like someone used to control, to power, to being seen. He hesitated. His jacket wasn't much, but it was all he had. It was the only barrier between him and the cold that had taken up residence in his bones. Still, he took it off. Without a word, he held it out to her. She looked at him in shock. "You don't have to," she began. Ethan shook his head. "I've already lost enough today," he said quietly. "This coat's the only thing I have left to give." She stared at him for a moment, unsure whether to accept, unsure what kind of man would give away the only thing keeping him warm on a night like this. But when he gently draped it over her shoulders, she didn't stop him. She just closed her eyes and let it wrap around her like a blanket of disbelief. It smelled faintly of soap, coffee, something comforting. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, folding his arms to his chest, now bare to the wind, and turned back to the street. They stood together in silence as the snow thickened around them. A few minutes later, a bus pulled up. She turned to him again. "Do you have somewhere to go?" He hesitated. "Somewhere," he replied vaguely, not mentioning that somewhere was the back seat of a '97 Chevy truck, parked behind an abandoned warehouse on the south side. She reached into her purse and handed him a business card. "In case you ever need anything," she said. He took it, but didn't look at it. People said things like that all the time. Most didn't mean it. She stepped onto the bus and disappeared into the warm blur of yellow light, the coat still wrapped tightly around her. Ethan watched until the doors shut behind her and the vehicle roared off into the snowy night. The wind howled louder now, and Ethan stood alone again beneath the street lamp, colder than before, yet strangely steadier. He looked down at the card in his hand, then up at the darkened sky. Maybe this night wasn't the end of something. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning. The snow had settled thick on the windshield of Ethan Walker's truck by the time he returned. The old Chevy groaned under his weight as he climbed in, the cold metal seat greeting him like an old, unwelcome friend. He tossed the damp folder onto the passenger seat and pulled a blanket over his lap, shivering violently. The jacket was gone. But oddly enough, something inside him was warmer than it had been in weeks. Months, maybe. He didn't know what had compelled him to offer it to her. The stranger with the trembling hands and sharp eyes. He didn't even know her name, but her voice had lingered in his mind. Thank you. 2 words that held more meaning than she could have guessed. He pulled out a small tin box from the glove compartment and opened it. Inside, folded neatly, was a faded photograph. Lily, his wife, beaming at the camera, and beside her, a gap-toothed boy no older than 7. His son, Jamie. Ethan brushed a thumb across their faces, then tucked the picture back and leaned against the frosted window. Still trying, Lily, he murmured. Still hoping. Miles away, in a penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, Ava Sinclair stood barefoot in her living room, the jacket still draped over her shoulders. She had stripped out of her heels and blouse, but she hadn't let go of the coat. It didn't belong in a place like this, next to Italian marble and designer couches. But she couldn't bring herself to take it off. She wandered into her kitchen, poured a glass of wine, and sat on the edge of a sleek leather sofa. In her lap, she turned the coat over carefully, fingers brushing across the worn seams. She felt something in the inner pocket and reached inside. Her hand closed around a folded piece of paper. Curious, she pulled it out and unfolded it slowly. It was a child's drawing, faded but still vibrant with color. 2 stick figures holding hands, one labeled Dad, the other Me. A crooked heart floated between them, and in a child's shaky handwriting, it read, I love you, Daddy. Jamie. The glass in Ava's hand trembled slightly. She set it down before it spilled and stared at the drawing, the smile on her face fading into something softer, something bruised. She thought about the way the man had held the folder, about the exhaustion in his posture, the gentleness in his voice. That drawing had been in his pocket, next to his heart. Whoever he wasn't just a man down on his luck. He was a father. A man who still carried his child with him in the only way he could. Ava looked around her immaculate apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows, curated art, minimalist furniture. Everything perfect. Everything cold. There were no pictures of family here. No drawings on the fridge. No handprints on the walls. Just success. Just silence. She folded the drawing back with care and held it to her chest, overwhelmed by something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Humility. When she was a child, no one had handed her warmth on a bitter night. She had clawed her way to the top of a world that had tried to ignore her, fought for her place in boardrooms that underestimated her. She built Sinclair and Gray from the ground up with nothing but grit and sleepless nights. But all of that power, all of that wealth, none of it had ever moved her the way that man's quiet sacrifice had. She picked up the business card she had given him, which he had returned folded in the inner pocket. A part of her had expected he would never call. Most men like him didn't, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't believe people like her really meant it. And that thought struck her like a cold slap. He hadn't even looked at the card, because to him, she was just another rich face making empty promises. Ava stood abruptly and crossed to her desk. She opened her laptop, fingers moving fast across the keyboard. She didn't know where to begin. All she had was a first name, Ethan. No last name, no address, just a coat, a drawing, and a moment she couldn't let go of. She pressed her hand to her lips, then whispered into the quiet, "Who are you, Ethan Walker?" And with a newfound sense of urgency, she resolved to find out. Not because she owed him a debt, but because in that one act of kindness, he had reminded her what being human really meant. The morning sun filtered weakly through the frost-flecked windows of the truck as Ethan stirred beneath a mound of mismatched blankets. The air inside was so cold, it felt like he was breathing ice. He sat up slowly, his joints aching from the damp chill and the stiffness of sleeping upright in a cab that hadn't been warm in months. He reached for the photograph of Jamie and Lily, as he did every morning, whispering a promise he'd repeated countless times. "I'm getting there. I swear it." He folded the blanket neatly, placed the tin box back in the glove compartment, and retrieved the folder containing his resume copies, now slightly crinkled from last night's snowfall. A long day lay ahead. Job fairs, walk-ins, maybe a stop at the library to check for listings. He hadn't expected much to change overnight. What he didn't know was that somewhere across town, a woman in a glass tower had already begun shifting the winds of fate. In her downtown office, high above Chicago's bustling streets, Ava Sinclair stared at her computer screen, scrolling through surveillance images from the block where she'd met Ethan. Her assistant, Layla, stood quietly beside her, watching her boss work with an intensity that was far removed from corporate deals and mergers. "He's in these 2 frames, Ava said, enlarging one grainy still from a bus stop camera. "Timestamp matches the moment I got there." Layla nodded, jotting notes. "We cross-referenced transit passes and cell pings, but there's no exact match yet." Ava tapped the screen gently. "What about local shelters? We called 3 nearby. Only one might have a Henry Walker registered in their meal logs, but we're checking if it could be a match." "It's Ethan," Ava said softly, correcting her. "Ethan Walker." Layla glanced at her, surprised. "You remembered? I never forgot." Ava paused, then added, "Keep going, quietly. This stays off record." A few hours later, Layla returned with a thin file. "We think we found him. A former structural engineer, laid off 5 years ago after his wife's illness. No arrests, no substance issues, just a slow unraveling." Ava opened the folder, eyes scanning over a scan of an old license photo. Less lined than the man she remembered, but unmistakably him. Her chest tightened. And now, he's been seen sleeping in a truck behind an old warehouse on the south side. That same beat-up Chevy shows up on traffic cameras near the bus stop. Ava closed the folder with care. "I want to go there." Layla blinked. "You mean personally?" "Yes." "Ms. Sinclair, I'm not sure that's..." This isn't business. This is something else. Less than an hour later, Ava sat in the back seat of a black car, weaving through the industrial grid of southern Chicago. The skyline faded behind her as the vehicle rolled into streets littered with frost-covered trash bins and graffiti-tagged warehouses. When they finally stopped, her driver pointed toward a corner of the lot. "That's the truck." Ava stepped out slowly, wrapping herself in a thick wool coat that, ironically, felt nothing like the one she'd received the night before. That one had carried warmth beyond just fabric, an unspoken dignity, a quiet sacrifice. The wind stung her cheeks as she approached the truck. The closer she got, the more surreal it felt. And then she saw him. Ethan had just stepped out, a battered thermos in one hand, rubbing his palms together. He froze mid-step when he saw her. His brows pulled together in confusion, then realization. "Miss," he said cautiously. Ava offered a soft smile. "Ava. Ava Sinclair." Ethan shifted his weight, glancing from her to the sleek car behind her. "What are you doing here?" "I came to find you," she said. He looked down at himself. Dusty jeans, boots covered in salt and snow, an unshaven jaw, and then back at her expensive coat and polished demeanor. "Well, you found me. I didn't come to embarrass you," she added quickly. "I just—" She paused, trying to find the right words. "You did something for me last night that you didn't have to do. And I realized after that I couldn't just let that moment disappear." Ethan's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in weary disbelief. "Most people don't come looking for men like me." "I'm not most people," she replied. Then before he could respond, she pulled something from her purse, the folded drawing. She held it out to him. He blinked, heart hammering. Slowly, he reached out and took it. "I found it in your coat pocket," Ava said, her voice gentling. "I thought you might want it back." Ethan opened the page, the edges curling slightly in his rough hands. For a long moment, he said nothing, but his shoulders dropped. His grip on the paper softened, and in his eyes, something long hardened gave way. "I didn't think I'd ever see this again," he whispered. "Well," Ava said, her voice catching, "you gave me something that reminded me of who I used to be. Maybe I can do the same for you." The wind howled again across the vacant lot, but for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel the cold, because someone had found him, and not just with an address or a file, but with purpose, with presence, with something dangerously close to hope. The next time Ethan saw Ava, it wasn't on the cold pavement of a warehouse lot or beneath flickering streetlights. It was at a construction site on the northern edge of Chicago. The winter sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the half-finished framework of a new school building. Ethan had picked up the day labor job through a flyer at the shelter bulletin board, just another chance to keep his hands busy and his mind quieter. He was lifting cinder blocks, his breath visible in the air, when he heard someone call his name. Not the gruff bark of a foreman, but a voice soft and unmistakable. He turned around to find Ava, again out of place, but perfectly composed, holding 2 steaming coffee cups. "Thought you could use something warm," she said, offering one to him. Ethan blinked in surprise, taking the cup with a rough hand that swallowed the paper sleeve. "You didn't have to come all the way out here." "I wanted to," she said, and there was something in her tone that left no room for argument. He took a sip, letting the heat work its way through him. They stood in silence for a moment, Her in her tailored coat, him in a threadbare flannel layered over a hoodie. Then she said, "Would you come with me?" Just for a little while. He hesitated, glancing back at the scaffold and the foreman. "I've still got a few hours left on the shift. I already spoke to him," she said, with a faint smile. "Told him you had an unexpected opportunity." Ethan narrowed his eyes. Opportunity for what? "You'll see." He followed her, unsure why, unsure what he expected. But there was something about Ava's presence that steadied the chaos in his mind. He watched her as they drove, her eyes fixed on the road, the corners of her lips drawn in thought. She wasn't just the woman at the bus stop anymore. She wasn't a stranger wrapped in his coat. She was something else now. Somehow, a tether to a version of himself he thought he'd lost. They pulled up in front of a sleek glass building nestled in the heart of downtown. Infinity Group. The name was etched in chrome letters beside the entrance. He'd seen it in headlines and tech journals before, long before his world fell apart. "I don't belong here," he said softly as he stepped out, staring up at the towering structure. "You belong wherever you have something to give," Ava said, her voice unwavering. "Come inside." Inside, everything was too bright, too polished. Ethan kept his hands in his pockets, conscious of the grime under his fingernails, the years etched into his face. They took the elevator in silence, rising high above the bustle of the city, until the doors opened into a quiet meeting room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that stretched to the lake. Ava gestured for him to sit. Across the table, she slid a folder toward him. "Before you open it," she began, "let me explain." He didn't move, just listened. "I've built this company on innovation, on ideas, on forward thinking," she said. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot something vital, something you reminded me of. People, humanity, kindness, without agenda." He looked at the folder, hesitant. "I created a position," she continued, "one that's never existed here before. It's called Director of Human Values and Culture. I want you to be it." Ethan blinked. "Me? You've lived things most of us only read about. You've survived loss, homelessness, hardship. And still, you gave without being asked. That experience, that empathy, that's something no Ivy League degree can replicate." "I haven't worked in years," he said quietly. "I don't have credentials anymore. I don't have a suit. I don't even have a home." Ava smiled gently. "What you have is far more rare. Perspective, heart, integrity. You taught me something I forgot. Now I'm giving you the chance to teach others." He stared down at the folder, his fingers tracing the edges but not opening it. His throat tightened, his chest hollowed with a blend of fear and disbelief. "This isn't charity," Ava added softly. "This is a job offer. And I believe you're the only person who can do it the way it needs to be done." The room went quiet. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the glass in a peaceful hush. Ethan looked up, eyes meeting Ava's, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man defined by what he had lost. He felt, instead, the faintest flicker of what he might still become. Ethan didn't respond right away. He sat with the folder resting on his knees, his hands idle on its surface, eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table. For a man who had lived day to day for years, who had trained himself to expect little and take less, this was more than a shock. It was a seismic shift. Ava didn't push. She simply waited. Finally, Ethan looked up. "I'm not sure what you expect me to say." "I don't expect anything," she replied. This is your decision. He hesitated, the weight of doubt pressing down. You've built something incredible here, Ava. This building, this company, this whole world. It's so far from where I come from, I can't even see the line that connects us. You don't have to see it, she said gently. You just have to trust it's there. He opened the folder slowly. His eyes skimmed over the contract, the role description, the modest but dignified salary. His breath caught when he saw a note clipped to the back page. Housing assistance, relocation support, and a quiet line in Ava's handwriting. Everyone deserves a warm place to return to. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. The part of him that had once dreamed of designing bridges, of sketching school foundations, of showing his son what pride in honest work looked like. It stirred again. But alongside that was fear. Fear of messing up. Fear of not being enough. What if I fail? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. Ava reached for her cup of coffee, took a small sip, and said, You already succeeded, Ethan. You showed up for someone when you didn't have to. You gave when you had nothing left. That's the foundation of everything we're trying to build here. He looked away, his eyes burning. You think that's enough to lead a corporate team? I think that's exactly what leadership is, she said. Compassion, listening, presence. We have experts in strategy. We need someone who reminds us why we're here. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with decision, with meaning. Finally, Ethan exhaled. I'll try, he said. Ava's smile was small but real. That's all I ask. Later that evening, Ethan stood outside the building, the folder tucked under his arm. The city buzzed around him, oblivious to the quiet miracle that had unfolded in that glass conference room. Snow dusted the sidewalk, catching in his graying hair. He pulled out his phone, an old, cracked device with barely enough battery, and typed a message. Hey, Noah, I might have some news. Can we talk tomorrow? He hit send before he could lose his nerve. He walked slowly back to his truck behind the warehouse. But something felt different this time. Not because the streets had changed, but because he had. The air didn't bite the same way. The night didn't seem as empty. The next morning, Ava arrived at her office to find a folded jacket neatly placed on her desk. It was the same one Ethan had given her at the bus stop, still worn, still a little frayed. Inside the pocket was a note, written in careful, deliberate handwriting. You said it changed your life. It saved mine, too. Keep it. Remember why you started this. That afternoon, the HR department received a new employee packet. Ethan Walker, 42, former engineer, father of one, currently transitioning out of homelessness, was officially added to the roster. What no one knew yet, but would soon discover, was that Ethan's quiet wisdom would shift more than one department's culture. His story would ripple far beyond the glass walls of Infinity Group, carried in conversations and internal memos, in changed hearts and softened perspectives. And as for Ethan, he went home that night to a warm, temporary apartment arranged by Ava's team, placed the folder on his nightstand, and called his son. Hey, kid, he said, smiling to himself. I think things are starting to turn around. Ethan Walker's first day at Infinity Group began not with a red carpet, but with hesitation. He stood in the sleek lobby, shoes polished, but old, his jacket clean, but threadbare. The receptionist gave him a kind, curious smile as he adjusted the strap on his second-hand satchel, clutching the onboarding folder Ava had sent him. Around him, young professionals buzzed past in tailored suits and confident strides, eyes on their devices, minds on deadlines. Ethan shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying not to look like he didn't belong. But inside, he still felt like the man standing at the bus stop, coatless in the snow. Rachel, Ava's assistant, met him by the elevators and walked him up to the 5th floor. Ava's in a board meeting this morning, but she left instructions. You'll be shadowing 2 teams this week: community engagement and internal culture. It's not technical, but it's meaningful. That's the point. Ethan nodded, grateful for her warmth. He tried to absorb everything: the layout of the office, the open concept workspaces, the wall of post-it notes filled with handwritten quotes and affirmations. The company didn't just talk about empathy, it seemed to live it. His desk was a modest one, tucked in a corner of the culture suite. A small plant sat there, a welcome card signed by 3 different departments, and a note in Ava's handwriting. You're not here to impress. You're here to inspire. By noon, he was already talking to staff. It started slowly. Someone asking his opinion on a draft for a mentorship program. Then someone else invited him to sit in on a discussion about team burnout. Ethan listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his words landed like quiet revelations. He didn't talk in corporate buzzwords or quote leadership books. He spoke from lived experience, the kind that couldn't be faked. I used to think failure looked like being broke, he told one young employee during a lunchtime conversation. But the real failure is forgetting how to care. The moment you stop seeing people as people, that's when everything breaks down. By the end of the day, 2 developers stopped by his desk just to thank him for being there. That night, in the quiet of his temporary apartment, Ethan pulled out the photograph of Noah and smiled. He texted his son, "First day went okay. Think I'm actually helping people again." He didn't expect a reply that night, but one came a minute later. "Proud of you, Dad. Let me know when I can visit." For the first time in years, Ethan fell asleep, not to the sound of a city street outside his truck, but to the gentle hum of possibility. The rest of the week brought more of the same, yet each moment felt like a new layer unfolding. Ethan found himself speaking at a small team retreat about resilience, not as a motivational speaker, but as someone who had lived it. He told them about the cold nights, about waiting in food pantry lines, about how much it meant to be truly seen by a stranger. He shared how, even in the dark, he tried to teach his son what hope looked like. Ava returned from her trip midweek and found her staff buzzing about the new guy. When she saw Ethan in action, standing by the whiteboard, quietly guiding a discussion on human-centered policy, she didn't interrupt. She just watched, smiling. Later, in her office, she called Rachel in. "I want to make Ethan's role permanent," she said. "But more than that, I want to create a program around it, a way to bring in others like him. Not just resumes, real stories, real hearts." Rachel raised an eyebrow, impressed. "A new department?" "Not just a department," Ava said, her voice soft with conviction. "A movement." That evening, Ethan found a sealed envelope on his desk. Inside was a letter, handwritten by Ava. "You are not a placeholder here. You are a lighthouse. Every time you speak, you remind us what we've forgotten, that people matter more than metrics. You've already changed this place, Ethan. Now let's change more." And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Ethan didn't feel like he was waiting for life to begin. It already had. The following weeks at Infinity Group unfolded like a slow bloom. What began as quiet curiosity about Ethan Walker's presence soon turned into something more substantial: respect, admiration, and even a kind of reverence. Employees from departments Ethan had never visited began dropping by his modest office space just to talk. They didn't come with agendas or proposals. They came with burdens: burnout, imposter syndrome, grief over personal loss, fear of failure. And somehow, they left lighter. It wasn't anything Ethan tried to do. He just listened, fully, attentively, like their words were the only thing in the world that mattered in that moment. And when he did speak, it was never to fix or advise, but to reflect back something they had forgotten about themselves. One afternoon, a young coder named Mason confessed, "I haven't seen my dad in 6 years. When I see how you talk about your son, it makes me want to try again." Another, a woman from the marketing team, broke down as she shared how exhausted she felt, hiding her anxiety at work. Ethan just nodded and said, "You don't have to wear armor here. This is your space too." The quiet ripples of Ethan's presence began to reshape the company's culture. Departments adopted new rituals: weekly gratitude circles, anonymous appreciation boards, check-in huddles that began not with KPIs, but with the simple question, "How are you, really?" Even the leadership team, once driven primarily by numbers, began inviting Ethan into strategic meetings, not for business insight, but to keep them human. But beyond the workplace, something else was shifting, something Ethan didn't expect. Ava, their interactions, once defined by professional boundaries, started to stretch into something more tender. After long meetings, they lingered in conversation. They started taking walks together after work, always under the pretense of discussing company morale or future initiatives. But somewhere, between the laughter, the thoughtful silences, and the shared glances, something unsaid began growing between them. One evening, after attending a community fundraiser organized by Infinity Group, Ava and Ethan found themselves walking along the quiet path by Central Park. The city's noise faded beneath the rustle of trees and the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. They weren't talking about work anymore. They were talking about life. Memories of Ava's childhood in foster care, Ethan's stories of bedtime science experiments with Noah in the back of their truck. At one point, Ava stopped walking. "You know," she said softly, "I used to believe kindness was something we couldn't afford, not when the stakes were high. But then you showed up and reminded me that kindness isn't a weakness. It's a compass." Ethan didn't respond right away. The wind brushed his face, and for a moment he was back at the bus stop, watching the snow fall around Claire. Only now, she was Ava, no longer shivering, no longer guarded, but open, glowing in the soft city lights. He looked at her, heart suddenly unsteady. "I used to think my best years were behind me," he said. "But now I'm not so sure." Ava reached out and took his hand, gently, with quiet certainty. Maybe the best years just needed the right reason. For a while, they said nothing. They just stood there, two people who had been broken by different battles, now whole enough to lean on each other. That night, Ethan returned home to find Noah waiting up for him. The boy had been staying over more often, their bond mending and deepening with every shared dinner, every late-night conversation. "Hey, Dad," Noah said, noticing something different in his father's expression. "Yeah?" Ethan replied, slipping off his shoes. "You look happy." Ethan paused, then chuckled. You know what? I think I am. And it wasn't the job. It wasn't the office or the title. It was this: being seen, being useful, being loved again in a world he once thought had forgotten him. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't just surviving. He was living. The morning sunlight spilled through the windows of the Infinity Group headquarters, casting golden reflections on the marble floors. Ethan walked through the lobby with his usual calm presence, nodding to the receptionist who now greeted him not just with politeness, but with genuine warmth. His days had settled into a rhythm: meetings, quiet conversations, walks through the building to check in on people who had begun to trust his presence more than any corporate policy. But today was different. Clutched in his hand was an envelope, thick and official, sent from the city housing department. It contained a deed, a final confirmation that the modest one-bedroom home on the edge of Brooklyn was no longer a rental. It was his. After years of drifting between temporary solutions and barely making ends meet, Ethan had a home again. A real one. A place for Noah to study, for dinners to be shared, for memories to be made beyond survival. Later that afternoon, Ava joined him at the new house. She brought a potted plant, green, hopeful, alive, and placed it on the windowsill with a smile. Every home needs something living, she said. Ethan smiled back, watching her with something deeper than affection in his eyes. I've got Noah, and now this. That already feels like a miracle. Noah arrived that evening. His backpack slung over one shoulder, his posture more confident than it had been in months. The boy walked through the door, took one look around the cozy, freshly painted space, and grinned. You actually did it, he said, voice filled with awe. You said you would, and you did. Ethan ruffled his hair. Told you it was just for now. You believed me, right? Noah nodded slowly. Yeah, I did. They celebrated that night with takeout pizza and soda, sitting on the floor around a borrowed coffee table. Ava stayed, quietly slipping into the warmth of the moment. It wasn't elaborate. There was no champagne or crystal glasses, but laughter echoed through the walls, and for the first time in years, it felt like a family had returned to itself. A few days later, at Infinity Group, Ava made an announcement that took everyone by surprise. A new initiative, called the Human Project, would launch under Ethan's leadership. Its purpose: to build deeper emotional intelligence within the company, create support systems for employee well-being, and foster a mentorship network for those who felt unseen. The proposal passed unanimously. Ethan stood at the front of the room as the announcement was made, overwhelmed by a standing ovation. Not for his title, not for a brilliant marketing campaign or a technological breakthrough, but because he had made people feel human again. He had reminded them that success was hollow without compassion. After the meeting, Ava pulled him aside. Her eyes sparkled, not just with pride, but with something deeper, something vulnerable. Do you realize what you've done? She asked. He looked at her, his voice steady. I didn't set out to change anything. I just didn't want to disappear. You didn't, she said. You became the reason others didn't either. The words settled in his chest like an anchor. Not heavy, just grounding. That evening, they returned to Thomas's place, the little community center Ava had built in honor of the man who once offered her warmth when she had none. Children played in the yard. Volunteers handed out warm meals. It was a place that didn't ask for perfection, only presence. Ethan watched it all with a quiet smile. You know, he said to Ava, as they sat beneath a canopy of string lights, when I gave you that coat, I thought it was just one moment in a long, cold night. And now? She asked, leaning a little closer. He turned to her. Now, I think it was the start of everything. Ava reached out, took his hand in hers, and nodded. It was, for both of us. And in the gentle glow of that evening, surrounded by laughter, by hope, by everything they never thought they'd find again, Ethan Walker realized something profound. Kindness had not only saved him, it had brought him home. The following weeks brought a quiet transformation, not just to Ethan's life, but to the entire culture within Infinity Group. What started as a heartfelt initiative began to ripple through the company in ways no one had anticipated. Ethan's office, once a small, unused corner room, had become a place where people came to breathe. Developers, managers, interns, even janitors sat in the worn armchairs across from him, speaking not about projects or deadlines, but about fears, exhaustion, purpose, and sometimes just silence. Ethan didn't offer fixes. He offered presence. One afternoon, a young programmer named Luis stopped by. His hands trembled as he sat down, his voice barely above a whisper, as he confessed how close he had come to walking away. Not just from his job, but from everything. I didn't think I mattered, he said, tears catching in the corner of his eyes. But when you stopped by the desk last week and asked how I was, you were the first person in months who looked like they actually wanted to hear the answer. Ethan didn't say much. He just nodded, leaned forward, and placed a hand gently on Luis's shoulder. You do matter, he said quietly. You always did. That simple sentence became a mantra, repeated across departments, and quietly etched on sticky notes pinned beside screens and cubicles. You do matter. Meanwhile, Ethan's connection with Ava had shifted into something deeper, though neither had named it yet. Their conversations stretched longer after work. Their silences became more comfortable. They had built something rare, not just romance, but refuge. They understood the weight each carried, and neither tried to lessen it, only to share it. One chilly Sunday morning, Ethan found himself standing in the middle of a community event, hosted by Infinity's outreach team at a small public park in Harlem. There were food stations, free job workshops, and volunteers handing out donated coats and shoes. Ava stood nearby, watching as Ethan knelt to help a child tie a worn sneaker. Her heart clenched, not from pain, but from the sheer quiet beauty of it. There he was, a man who had once slept in a truck, now showing others what it looked like to rise and bring others with him. Later that night, they walked together through the now empty park, quiet between them. Ethan finally broke the silence. You ever think about how crazy this all is? Ava smiled. Every day. I mean, if I hadn't been at that bus stop, if you'd had a coat, if I'd just stayed quiet. She stopped and turned to face him. Then maybe I'd still be living in a penthouse with a view and thinking I had everything, while missing the only thing that really matters. And what's that? He asked, his voice soft. She looked at him, her eyes unwavering. People. Connection. Moments that remind you you're human. Ethan nodded slowly. I was so close to giving up, and now I don't even recognize the man I was a year ago. You were always him, she said. You just forgot for a while. Now you remember, and you're helping others remember too. He took a deep breath, the air crisp in his lungs. I used to think I had nothing left to give. Now I realize the most valuable thing I ever gave wasn't that coat. It was showing up for someone without knowing what would come of it. Ava reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. And because of that, you changed my life. You gave me back something I didn't even know I'd lost. The wind rustled the trees around them, but neither moved. They stood under the streetlight like the first night they met. Two people wrapped not in wealth or status, but in something much rarer, truth. In the distance, the hum of the city carried on. But here, in this small corner of the world, everything was still. Ethan looked at Ava and knew. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. 1 year later, the headquarters of Infinity Group looked nothing like it had when Ethan first stepped through its towering glass doors. The lobby, once sleek and impersonal, now held art from local youth programs, photos from community events, and a large mural that read in soft gold lettering, "One act can change everything." Underneath was a plaque with a name engraved not in corporate titles or accolades, but in gratitude. Ethan Walker. That day, the company was hosting something new, an initiative Ethan and Ava had co-created, Humanity in Leadership Day. Executives, interns, janitors, clients, and community members gathered in the atrium. There were no slide decks or charts, only stories. Stories of resilience, hope, and transformation. Ethan stepped to the stage, dressed simply, his voice steady. He didn't speak like a man who had once felt invisible. He spoke like someone who had become a mirror, reflecting the worth he now helped others see in themselves. "I used to think the lowest point in my life was the day I lost my home," he said, pausing. "But now I see that day was actually a doorway, a turning point, because in the silence that followed, I realized I still had one thing left: choice. I could choose to be bitter, or I could choose to be kind, even when I had nothing." He glanced at Ava standing off stage, her eyes soft, filled with the same unwavering support she'd given him since that night at the bus stop. "I gave my coat to a stranger," he continued, "not because I thought it would lead anywhere, but because in that moment I couldn't stand to see someone suffer if I could do something, anything, about it. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know she was a CEO. I didn't know she'd show up at my truck days later and remind me that even the smallest actions carry weight." The room was hushed, breathless. We build our legacies not through the titles we hold, but through the lives we touch. That truth changed me. It brought me back to my son, to purpose, to love. And now, I get to help others see their own value, no matter where they are on the ladder of life. Applause broke out, but Ethan raised a hand gently. "I want you to meet someone," he said, stepping aside as Ava joined him. "This is the woman who didn't just give me a job. She gave me back my dignity, my direction, and, eventually, my heart." There was a flicker of surprise in the audience. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. A quiet gasp rolled through the crowd as he turned to Ava. "Ava Bennett," he said, his voice catching. "The night we met, I gave you my coat. You gave me a future. I can't imagine mine without you in it. Will you marry me?" The moment held like a suspended breath. Ava's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with emotion. Then, nodding through tears, she whispered, "Yes, absolutely, yes." Cheers erupted. It was not just a proposal. It was a full circle moment, one that reminded everyone watching what it meant to believe in second chances, in the unexpected, and in the profound power of grace. Weeks later, their wedding was held in the same park where they had once hosted a coat drive together. The ceremony was simple, heartfelt, surrounded by people from all walks of life. Ava wore a soft, elegant dress. Ethan stood in a navy suit, his son Noah at his side, now taller and stronger, beaming with pride. There were children laughing in the background, volunteers handing out meals, and live music played by a group of street performers Ethan had once known by name. As they exchanged vows beneath the blooming cherry blossoms, Ethan's voice trembled as he said, "You found me in the cold and gave me warmth, not just in body, but in soul. With you, I am seen. I am whole." Ava smiled, eyes glistening. "You reminded me what leadership really means, what humanity looks like. You gave me more than love, Ethan. You gave me my own heart back." Their kiss wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was quiet, intentional, the kind that comes after miles of walking through fire and coming out the other side hand in hand. That night, as they danced under string lights with their friends, their employees, and their community, Ethan looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you for the storm. Without it, I never would have found her." And from that day on, the story of a man who gave away his coat in a snowstorm wasn't just a tale passed around a boardroom. It became a movement, one that showed the world that kindness is never wasted, and sometimes the smallest gestures birth the greatest love stories ever told. Ethan Walker's story began in the shadows of loss and hardship. At 42, once a successful structural engineer, he found himself without a home, without steady work, and separated from his son. Life had stripped him of many things: comfort, stability, even his identity. But on one frigid night at a quiet New York bus stop, he chose something most would overlook: kindness. When he offered his only jacket to a stranger shivering in the cold, he didn't expect anything in return. He didn't know that the woman he'd selflessly helped was Ava Bennett, a powerful and influential CEO who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen with sincerity. That single moment, a spontaneous gesture of compassion, became the spark that would transform both of their lives. Ava, touched by Ethan's humanity, couldn't forget his warmth or the drawing she found tucked in the coat's pocket. A child's message of love that silently told a bigger story. Her search to find Ethan wasn't just about gratitude. It was about redemption, reconnection, and remembering the power of authenticity in a world driven by surface-level success. As their lives intertwined, Ethan went from sleeping in a truck to walking into a boardroom, not with a resume, but with a story that would shape company culture, heal broken spirits, and remind executives and interns alike that leadership starts with empathy. He wasn't just hired, he was valued. And as he rebuilt his life, reconnecting with his son, finding purpose in his work, and ultimately falling in love with Ava, the world around him shifted too. Kindness rippled outward. From his quiet guidance at Infinity Group to his mentorship of struggling youth, from coffee room conversations to a viral moment of vulnerability that touched hearts across the country. Their wedding wasn't just a celebration of love. It was a symbol of what can happen when we choose to see the person behind the struggle, the heart behind the hardship. It was about two people who had built walls for survival, learning to take them down and build something stronger together. And that old coat? It now hangs in the headquarters of Infinity Group, a testament to the truth that one small act can rewrite a destiny. The lesson we take from Ethan and Ava's journey is this: no act of kindness is ever wasted. In a world often moving too fast, filled with judgment, competition, and disconnection, we must remember the simple but extraordinary power of compassion. That even when we feel we have nothing left to give, a moment of grace can become someone else's miracle. So ask yourself, what can you do today to be someone's turning point? If this story moved your heart, reminded you of the good that still exists, and inspired you to believe in second chances, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful, emotional stories that stir the soul and shine a light on what truly matters: love, humanity, and hope. Until next time, stay kind and keep believing.